So the Bender family was from LaBelle County, Kansas. In 1871, they were known as a family of serial killers called the Bloody Benders. They were consisted of John Bender Sr., John Bender Jr., John Bender's wife Elvira, and the daughter Kate. The neighbors say Kate and John Jr. were actually husband and wife. So John Sr. and John Jr. arrived in LaBelle County, Kansas in 1870. They lived in kind of a commune with a group of 5 other homesteaders, and they had about 160 acres. Kate and Elvira actually came later that year, and they built a small area for them to stay, and they had it separated into 2 rooms. So in the front of their little building, they built a little shop where they could sell dry goods and different items like that. They cooked meals for travelers. Kate and Elvira actually planted a 2-acre vegetable garden. So John Bender was about 60 years old and Elvira was about 55-year-old, and they both spoke very little English. So Elvira Bender was actually so mean that her neighbors referred to her as a she-devil. Basically, John Jr. was 25 and somewhat good looking, and apparently he would just laugh for no reason, so some people thought he was a half-wit. Kate Bender was 23 and apparently very attractive, and she had little accent, where John Jr. did have a German accent as well. So the daughter Kate was very popular in the town. She believed in spirituality and she held seances, and she also believed that she could heal people with her thoughts and actions and things like that, that she was a spiritual healer and a psychic and whatnot. The family actually decided to start an inn or a motel. So basically, Kate became very popular at the family's motel. So during all these spiritual lectures Kate was giving, she had mentioned that murder might be a dictation for good, and that the world might deem villainy, or that killing people might be a good thing, or certain people. Like I mentioned, she also advocated for free love, which meant she thought it was okay to love her brother and to have multiple loves and things like that. So she had some very out there ideas. It sounds like maybe she did a little too many seances, and maybe, had something take over her. And, it sounds like the father was basically a repulsive, hideous brute, John Sr., and the mother was just a bitter old witch, hag-looking woman, just an angry lady. So very, very rough. And they compared John Jr.'s laugh to that of a ravenous hyena. So not the best description of this family. So the way the Benders would lure people into their inn and kill them would be they would have them at dinner, and they would have them sit at a certain chair that was right over a trap door next to a curtain. So basically, if you're sitting, or if I'm sitting in a chair with a curtain behind me, they would have the beautiful young Kate entertain or preoccupy the person, and then John Jr. or Sr. would come back from behind the curtain and hit the person in the head with a hammer. Then they would open the trap door, and the person would drop down into the cellar where all the other victims would go. So the Bender family would generally kill wealthy travelers. Back in the old days when you were traveling from place to place, you would take all of your equipment and property with you. So they would focus on them, but it sounds like sometimes they killed just for the thrill of it. On a couple different accounts, guests actually escaped their grasp. So we had one guy named William Pickering that was not wanting to sit in that chair by the curtain, and Kate actually pulled out a knife and threatened him, so he ran out the back door. There was actually a priest that was there that saw John Bender carrying a large hammer, made him uncomfortable, so he went out and said he had to tend to his horses and took off. There was another occasion where a guest named Mrs. Fitz was there at the inn, and she heard some commotion behind the curtain, and she literally took off and ran as quick as she could before whatever was behind the curtain could get to her. So it sounds pretty terrifying. And now, being they had a inn and a store, the Benders would actually take these stolen items that they would take from their victims, and they would sell them right at their store. And they would use the guise or the cover of basically saying that someone couldn't pay for their room, so we got this saddle, do you want to buy it? Two men had actually traveled to the inn to experience Kate's psychic abilities, and they didn't want to sit by the curtain. They sat at the bar counter, and Kate became very angry and abusive toward them, and they couldn't understand why. And after a while, both John Sr. and John Jr. came out from behind the curtain. So they felt uncomfortable, and they got out of there as quick as they could. Overall, after the bodies and victims were discovered and the crimes were discovered, I guess there was 22 different bullet holes in the ceiling and sides of the cabin that they guess were likely from guests that had been hit with the hammer and then pulled out the gun to try to defend themselves and probably got hit again. So on May 1st, 1871, a man named Mr. Jones's body was found in Drum Creek with a crushed skull and a slit throat. Very, very sad. On February 2nd, 1872, two identified men were found on the prairie with the same exact injuries. In December 1872, Ben Brown had a $2,600 reward, and he was buried in the apple orchard near the Benders' property. December 1872, W.F. McCrotty had $38 missing, and a team of horses was missing, and he was gone. He disappeared. On December 6th, 1872, Henry Mackenzie also disappeared, and he had $36 and a team of horses as well. So you're kind of seeing a trend here that these people are either turning up, in the creek or buried, or they're just disappearing with, a team of horses and, everything, all their property, So a man named George Newton in December also disappeared with his 18-month-old daughter. So I'm sad to say George and his daughter went missing, as well as their team of horses, and they were both found in the apple orchard near the Benders' property as well. So right around this time, as you can tell, in 1872, they are looking pretty thoroughly in this apple orchard by the Benders' property, and they're finding several bodies. So in December, they found a man named John. They found a man named Red Smith. They found Abigail Roberts. They found various body parts buried. They found 4 unidentified skulls, one of which may have been a man named Jack Bogart, whose horse was eventually purchased from the Bender family. So there's just so many different victims and unknown victim potentials here. It's really hard to keep track of. The last victim here is May 1873. Dr. William York had $2,000 missing, and he was also found buried in the apple orchard. So the apple orchard actually was about a mile from the Bender property, and it's now known as the Bender Mounds because of all the different burials that were there. By 1873, there were so many reports of missing people that people actually avoided the trail going near the Benders and around the Benders property. So several weeks after all the bodies were found, the Benders had fled during the excavation of the bodies, and basically 12 different men were arrested in connection to all of these murders for being accomplices in one way or another. Either they helped dispose of bodies, or they received stolen goods, things of that nature. It's reported that in October of 1889, the authorities actually tracked down Elvira and Kate Bender. The daughter of one of their victims was actually having dreams regarding the father's murder and their killers, and gave detectives pointers on where to find the Bender sisters, and they went and tracked them down and arrested them. During the trial, it sounds like the Bender gals denied their identity, and they could not prove that these were actually the same women that were in the Bender hotel. It sounds like they may have been some different women, and it may have been a case of false identity. So these two gals were let go. So there ended up being several different stories on where the Benders went. There are stories that they headed down south to join up with an outlaw colony, that they headed out to St. Louis, Missouri. And there are all kinds of vigilante groups out looking for the Benders to serve some justice to them for what they had done. There were reports that John Bender had been picked up in Montana for murder later on, because they found a victim with a hammer injury to the head. There were reports that they committed suicide, that they went all kinds of different places. They did have a reward offered for the Benders for quite some time, but it sounds like no real leads were created from this reward. Because there were so many wild stories going around about this family and where they had gone and what they had done, there were several people that wanted a souvenir from the cabin and wanted to see the site. So several people were going to that site, and they actually ended up destroying the cabin and getting rid of everything there. Basically 3,000 people visited the site, so it was no small number for that time. So it sounds like the fact that the family was using aliases very likely, and the lack of photographs back in that time period, that they somewhat disappeared. It was very debated on who they were, what they looked like. It sounds like there was a lot of different stories going around. During the search of the cabin, they did find 3 different hammers. They found like a small, medium, and large hammer, and they actually put them in a case, and they had a Bender museum in Cherryville, basically with the hammers and different items of the Benders on display. So I believe that is still on display at a museum in that area to this day. So thank you for coming along to hear about the Bloody Benders. I appreciate it. Please like and subscribe.